There's a moment, and I think most people who have spent any real time around Buckingham Palace know exactly what I'm talking about, when the crowd goes from cheerful tourist noise to something else entirely. Something quieter, something that feels like the air itself is holding its breath. I've stood outside those iron gates maybe a dozen times over the years. I grew up in Croydon, took the tube into central London more times than I can count, and I've watched the changing of the guard since I was young enough to sit on my father's shoulders just to see above the heads of everyone else. So I know what that place sounds like on an ordinary morning. The low murmur of cameras, children asking questions their parents can't properly answer. The occasional pigeon landing somewhere it shouldn't, tour guides speaking in 6 languages at once. That's what it normally sounds like. But on the morning I'm going to tell you about, a wet Tuesday in late October, with the kind of gray sky that feels like a ceiling pressing down on the whole city, the sound that cut through everything was not a pigeon. It was a voice, an American voice. Loud, confident, the kind of voice that believes the world is designed for its convenience. And the moment I heard it, I turned around, because something in the pitch of it, something in the particular quality of its certainty, told me that whatever was about to happen, I didn't want to miss it. I should set the scene properly, because the details matter. It was a Tuesday, like I said, around 10:30 in the morning. The changing of the guard wasn't scheduled until 11, so the crowd gathered along the railings was still in that loose, casual phase, people shuffling into position, debating where to stand, children being lifted and repositioned. It wasn't packed the way it gets in summer. October thins the tourist numbers considerably. But there were still maybe 150 people spread along that stretch of pavement. Couples, families, a school group from somewhere in Scandinavia, judging by the matching yellow lanyards. The rain had stopped about 20 minutes earlier, but the ground was still slick, and the air had that particular London quality where the cold doesn't announce itself immediately. It just settles in, quietly. Into your collar, into your wrists, into the space between your shoulder blades. I was standing maybe 30 feet from the main gate, just slightly back from the front of the crowd. I had a coffee I'd picked up from a cafe on Birdcage Walk, still warm, still drinkable. I wasn't there for any particular reason that morning. I'd had an early meeting that canceled last minute, and I was killing time before heading back to my office in Victoria. The palace was just there. It always is. The 2 guards on duty at the main gate were standing in their usual positions, facing outward. These were not the ceremonial soldiers from the photos on every tourist postcard. These were the real ones, the ones actually guarding the perimeter. They wore the full uniform, the bearskin caps, the scarlet tunics, the pressed trousers, but there was nothing decorative about the way they stood. Anyone who's ever looked closely enough knows the difference between a soldier performing and a soldier working. These men were working. The one on the left, the one this story is about, I'll describe him carefully because he matters. He was tall, built with the kind of solid, quiet mass that doesn't announce itself. Somewhere in his mid-20s, I'd guess, though it's hard to judge properly beneath the bearskin. His face was completely still. Not blank exactly, still, like water before something disturbs it. His gloved hands rested at his sides with a precision that seemed almost architectural. He was looking straight ahead, past the crowd, past the tourists, past whatever noise the morning was making, looking at some fixed point that only he could see. I noticed him specifically before anything happened. That's the part that I keep coming back to, even now. Something about the quality of his stillness made you look at him. The man who caused everything, and I've thought about how to describe him, because I want to be fair even if I'm not particularly inclined toward generosity in this case, was in his 50s, I'd say, well-dressed in an expensive, slightly wrong way. The kind of expensive that tells you a person has money but not necessarily taste. He was wearing a North Face jacket in a deep blue, new-looking, and one of those branded baseball caps that cost more than they should. He was with a woman I assumed was his wife and 2 teenagers who had the glazed, mildly suffering expression of children dragged somewhere they didn't choose. He was taking photographs, a lot of photographs, and talking while doing it, which is something I find particularly exhausting in other people, the constant narration of their own experience as they're having it. "Get closer to the gate, honey. Can you move? Sorry, just 1 second, I just need." These guys literally cannot move, you know that. They're trained to not even blink. It's insane. It's an actual thing. This last part was delivered to no one in particular. A general broadcast, an announcement to the surrounding crowd about what he knew. A few people glanced at him. Nobody responded. He moved closer to the gate. The Scandinavian school group shuffled to accommodate him, and he moved through the gap without acknowledging it. He raised his camera, a serious one, not a phone, one of those large-lens DSLR affairs, and began photographing the guard on the left. Up close. I mean close, closer than is comfortable. Closer than the painted line on the pavement that every tourist instinctively understands means this far and no further. He stepped over that line. Not dramatically, not in a way that registered immediately as a violation. Just gradually, by small degrees, the way a tide comes in. You don't notice each individual movement, but suddenly you realize the water is much higher than it was. He was now roughly 4 feet from the guard's face. The guard did not move. Of course he didn't move. But I was watching his face, and I saw something so slight that I might have imagined it, but I don't think I did. I saw the muscles along his jaw tighten, just fractionally, the way a cable tightens when weight is added to it. What happened next escalated in stages. The man with the camera got his photographs. He was satisfied for about 30 seconds. Then he lowered the camera and looked at the guard the way someone looks at a statue in a museum. That examining, slightly proprietorial gaze, as if the thing being looked at exists for the looking. "Hey," he said. The guard said nothing. "Hey, buddy, can you turn like just slightly, to the left? The light's better." "Nothing. Just slightly, man, come on." The woman behind him, his wife, I was now certain, said quietly, "David, don't." "I'm not doing anything, I'm asking a question." He leaned slightly forward. Not aggressively, with that particular American confidence that I think isn't malicious exactly, but operates from such a fundamental assumption of being accommodated that it reads as aggression to everyone watching. Seriously, though, you can break character for like 1 second. You literally won't get in trouble. I've done this before, I know how it works. He'd done this before, he knew how it worked. I looked around me. The people nearby had gone quiet. A woman to my left had stopped raising her phone to take photographs. A couple near the gate, British, older, the kind of people who communicate disapproval through increasingly precise stillness, had turned slightly toward what was happening. The guard was still motionless. "Okay," the man said. He straightened up, adjusted the cap. The teenagers were looking at their phones. "Okay, you know what? I get it. You're doing your job. Good for you. I respect it." He said this in the tone of someone who did not particularly respect it. Then he turned to the crowd around him, to this loose, shifting assembly of strangers from a dozen different countries, and said, with a kind of performed bewilderment that expected laughter, "Can you believe this? I'm just asking the guy to turn his head. It's not like I'm trying to get into the palace." A few people offered the weakest possible social smiles, the ones you give because refusing to engage at all feels impolite. I didn't smile. I was still watching the guard. And that was when I noticed something had changed. The guard was still facing forward, still motionless in every technical sense. But there was something different about him now. Something in the quality of his attention had shifted. He was no longer looking at his fixed point on the horizon. He was, very slightly, tracking the man in front of him. Not with his eyes exactly, something subtler than that. A heightened awareness, a preparedness, like a sleeping animal that isn't sleeping anymore. The man, David, his wife had called him, had turned back now and was fiddling with his camera. He pulled his phone out as well, wanting to do a video, apparently. He held it up, framed the guard in the shot. "Okay, buddy," he said, in the cheerful tone of someone recording themselves for social media. "This is for my followers back home. They're not gonna believe this." He moved forward again. Past the line again. Closer this time. "Say hi to America," he said, holding the phone about 2 feet from the guard's face. And this is the moment. Because what happened next was not what David expected. It was not what the crowd expected. It was not, if I'm honest, what I expected. The guard moved. Not to step back, not to turn away, not in any direction that could have been interpreted as retreat or accommodation. He turned his head, sharply, precisely, with the controlled deliberateness of someone who has made a decision, and he looked directly at David. Not through him, not past him. At him, and in a voice that was low but absolutely, perfectly clear. The kind of voice that carries without shouting, the kind that enters the ear and settles there, he said. "Sir, you are required to step back behind the line." 4 feet of crowd went completely silent. I want to try to explain what that moment felt like, because simply describing what was said doesn't capture it. The guard had not raised his voice. He had not shifted his posture. He had not moved his hands from his sides or changed the angle of his body in any threatening way. Everything about his physical presence was still, controlled, professional. But he had spoken, and if you know anything about how these men operate, if you've ever spent any real time watching them work, you understand that when a royal guard speaks, when he breaks from his discipline to address someone directly, something has crossed a threshold. Some line has been passed that isn't painted on the pavement. David blinked. It was a reflex, a small, involuntary recalibration of the entire situation, as his brain reassembled what was happening in front of him. His phone was still raised. The guard was still looking at him, waiting. The seconds stretched. David lowered the phone. Not quickly, not with humility, but he lowered it. "Okay," he said, and there was something different in his voice now, a register he hadn't been using before, quieter. "Okay, I hear you." He took one step back, then another. The guard held his gaze for a moment longer, just a breath, just enough, and then his head returned precisely to its forward position. The movement was so exact it looked mechanical, as if a switch had been thrown. As if the entire exchange had been a brief interruption in a process that was now resuming exactly where it had been paused. The crowd didn't applaud. Nobody said anything for a moment. And then very quietly from somewhere to my right, from an older man in a gray coat, British accent, the kind of voice that sounds like it learned itself in a library, I heard. "About time." And that was the end of the beginning. But it wasn't the end of the story. Because David, to his partial credit, I suppose, didn't storm off. He didn't make a scene. He moved back into the crowd with the look of someone who has had a conversation internally and reached a conclusion that cost him something. His wife touched his arm briefly. He didn't respond, but he didn't pull away. One of his teenagers, the older one, a girl of maybe 16, was looking at the guard with an expression I recognized, because I'd worn it myself at that age. That particular look of being unexpectedly impressed by something. Of watching someone exercise authority without cruelty and finding it, against your expectation, moving. The crowd resettled. The murmuring resumed. 3 people over-explained in German what had just happened, and there was a brief collective sound of understanding. And then, I think this is the detail I keep coming back to, a sound that might have been approval. Just a murmur, just the crowd recognizing something. But real. I turned back to the guard. He was exactly as he'd been before, still, exact, looking at that horizon only he could see. But I was close enough to watch his face, and I want to be honest about what I saw. I saw a young man doing something extraordinarily difficult with extraordinary composure, and doing it not for the tourists watching or for the cameras still pointed in his direction, but because it was his, because that post was his, and that ground was his to hold, and the standards he was meeting were his own. I don't know his name, I never will. But that morning, outside those gates, he reminded me of something I hadn't thought about in a while. Some things are worth doing exactly right. The changing of the guard began at 11 o'clock exactly. By then the crowd had grown considerably, the way it always does in the final 15 minutes, people arriving quickly as if responding to some signal no one actually sent. The school group from Scandinavia had arranged themselves in a careful line, their teachers doing the mathematics of visibility in real time, calculating which children needed to stand where. A tour guide near me had switched from Spanish to Italian and back again, because she had listeners from both languages in her group and wasn't willing to abandon either one. David and his family were still there. I noticed this because I wasn't sure they would be. After what had happened, after that quiet, absolute moment near the gate, I half expected them to drift away. That's what most people do when they've been embarrassed in a small but public way. They find a reason to be somewhere else. But David was still there, standing slightly further back from where he'd been. He had his camera around his neck, but he wasn't raising it. He was just watching. His wife stood beside him with her arms crossed, not angry exactly. More like a woman who has been patient for a very long time and has developed a deep and private relationship with that patience. His daughter, the teenager I'd noticed earlier, had worked her way to the front of the crowd. She was standing directly against the railing now, her phone held up not to perform for it, but to genuinely document what she was seeing. There was a quality of attention in her that reminded me of her father's attention, but quieter, less broadcast. More curious. The ceremony itself is something I've watched many times. I've seen it in summer when the crowd is 4 people deep and children cry from the noise and the sun and the sheer weight of the occasion. And I've seen it on mornings like this one, gray and damp, and attended by people who are not performing enthusiasm, but are simply watching something old and careful and done well. The new guard companies came up the mall. You hear them before you see them. The band first, the music distinct and formal, the drums that seem to organize the chest cavity whether you want them to or not. Then the troupe itself, moving with the specific precision of people who have practiced this, until the practice became something else entirely, until it became instinct wearing the shape of ceremony. I always watch people watching the changing of the guard. Not the ceremony itself, I know what that looks like. I watch the faces of the people watching it because there's something honest about what happens to a crowd when it encounters something done with complete seriousness. All the small, social performativeness drains away. People stop angling their phones for the right frame. They just look. Even the teenagers look. Even David. He was standing still, watching the incoming guard company with an expression I couldn't fully read, but which contained something that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier. Not shame, exactly. Something more complicated. The face of someone recalibrating not just a moment, but a habit. The guard who had spoken to him, I'll call him the first guard for clarity, had been relieved during the ceremony. He was now standing in formation with his unit, not at the gate but back within the courtyard, part of the departing company. I caught a glimpse of him through the gates as the ceremony concluded, a figure among others, indistinguishable from where I stood unless you'd been watching him for the last hour. I had been watching him for the last hour. So I found him in the group. He was carrying himself identically to everyone around him. The same precision, the same controlled bearing, the same face that revealed nothing and somehow, because of that, revealed everything. A woman next to me, late 60s, Northern English accent, the kind of hat that announces itself, leaned toward her husband and said, quietly enough that she probably didn't intend me to hear it. "That's the one who spoke to that rude man." Her husband nodded without looking up from his phone. "Handled it right," he said. "Handled it perfectly," she corrected. After the ceremony, the crowd began to move. The Scandinavian school group reformed around their teachers and began the slow negotiation of which direction to walk. The German couple near me were consulting something on a tablet. The tour guide with 2 languages was gesturing toward St. James's Park. I stayed. I don't fully know why. I had somewhere to be. The meeting that had been canceled had been replaced by something else, and I was already running late, technically. But I stayed. David was still there, too. His wife and the younger teenager, a boy 12 or 13, were making their way toward the park. But David and his daughter were both still facing the gates. She was looking at her phone, scrolling through the photographs she'd taken. He was looking at the gates. I moved slightly closer, not to intrude, just closer. After a moment, his daughter held up her phone to him, showing him something on the screen. A photograph, presumably. He leaned over to look at it. I couldn't see the image from where I was standing, but I saw his face when he looked at it. And whatever was in that photograph, whatever she'd caught in the frame during the ceremony or before it, it did something to his expression. Something shifted. Opened, maybe, the way a fist opens. He nodded slowly, said something to her. She said something back. He put his arm around her shoulders briefly, awkwardly, the specific awkwardness of a man who doesn't naturally express warmth trying to express warmth, and then dropped it again. They stood there together for another few minutes, just looking at the gates. Then they turned and followed his wife and son into the park. I should tell you about something that happened after they left. There was a boy 9, maybe 10, one of those boys with the particular kinetic intensity that seems to vibrate through whatever clothing they're wearing, who had been standing near the gates with his mother for the duration of the entire morning. He'd been patient in the way that sometimes surprises you in children. He hadn't complained or pushed or demanded anything. He just watched very carefully the whole time. After the crowd had thinned, after the ceremony was done and the new guards had taken their positions, this boy walked up to the gate. He didn't cross the line. He stood exactly at the line, with the deliberateness of a child who has been told about it and has decided to take it seriously, and he looked up at the new guard at the gate. The new guard was different from the first guard, shorter, different build, the same absolute stillness. The boy looked up at him for a long moment. Then the boy straightened his back. He pulled his shoulders back, he lifted his chin, he put his hands at his sides. He was standing at attention. Not perfectly, he was 9 years old, his feet weren't quite right, one hand was slightly turned outward. But the intention was unmistakable. His mother made a soft sound behind him, not quite a laugh, warmer than that. The guard on duty, I watched very closely, made no movement, gave no acknowledgement. Except, I was close enough to see his eyes. And his eyes moved, just barely, just for a fraction of a second, to the boy standing in front of him, and then back to the horizon. That was all. But it was enough. The boy stood at attention for another 10 seconds, then dropped his pose and ran back to his mother with the self-satisfied energy of someone who has completed something meaningful. I don't know if his mother saw what I saw in the guard's eyes. I don't know if the boy did either. But I did. There's something about that morning that I've thought about many times since then. I've tried to put my finger on exactly what moved me about it, and I keep arriving at the same place. It wasn't the confrontation itself, exactly. Tourists push against the rules at Buckingham Palace every single day. Every guard stationed there has seen a version of what David did 100 times or more. The specific choreography of the entitled tourist testing a boundary isn't new or interesting in itself. What was interesting, what felt important, was the response. Not just that the guard spoke, but the way he spoke, with no emotion that could be used against him. No irritation, no contempt, no small satisfaction at having authority. Just clarity. Just the simple, specific language of someone who knows exactly what is required of the moment and provides exactly that and nothing more. I have met very few people in my life who can do that. I mean it, very few. Most of us, when we've been pushed, when someone has leaned into our space and tested our patience and performed their privilege in front of a watching crowd, most of us respond with something extra. A sharpness, an edge. Something personal. He responded with nothing personal at all. And that, paradoxically, felt like the most personal thing I'd seen all morning. It felt like character. Like the thing you can only be when the role you're playing and the person you actually are have become exactly the same thing. I left maybe an hour after the ceremony. I walked down through St. James's Park, past the pelicans doing their usual performance near the water, past the office workers on early lunch who sat on benches eating sandwiches with the look of people who had claimed 12 minutes of peace and intended to defend it. I passed, without recognizing them at first, a family sitting on a bench near the bridge. David and his family. His wife was eating something from a paper bag. The younger boy was throwing bread to the birds, with his father's specific inefficiency at it. The daughter was still on her phone, but differently, she was typing, not scrolling, writing something or messaging someone. And David was sitting slightly apart from all of them, not in a disconnected way, but in the way of someone who is just thinking. His camera was on his lap. He wasn't photographing anything. I walked past, and he glanced up briefly. We made eye contact for a single second in the way strangers sometimes do in cities, the flicker of mutual acknowledgement before looking away. He didn't know I'd been watching him all morning. He looked like a man in the middle of something internal, working something out. Adjusting something that had been slightly wrong for so long he hadn't noticed, and now noticed. I didn't say anything. I just kept walking. But I remember his face. The palace is still there. Obviously, it's still there. But you know what I mean when I say that sometimes places accumulate the things that happen in front of them. They don't keep records. They don't remember. But you come back and you feel the accumulated weight of all the mornings that have been lived out on that pavement, and it becomes something heavier and more interesting than stone and iron and old tradition. I went back the following month on a different morning, just to stand there for a while. The guards at the gate were different, of course they were. But they were standing in exactly the same way, that same quality of absolute, inhabited stillness. And the crowd was gathered in exactly the same loose, cheerful formation, and children were asking the same questions and tour guides were speaking the same dozen languages. And somewhere in the middle of it all, someone was probably pushing too close to the line. Someone always is. But the line holds. It always holds. I told this story once, about 3 weeks after it happened, to a colleague of mine. We were having lunch near our office, and she asked me what I'd been doing that week, and I said, "Nothing interesting," and then immediately started telling her about the guard and David and the boy standing at attention. And by the time I finished, she was looking at me with the slightly exasperated expression of someone who has caught a person being dishonest about themselves. "That's clearly the most interesting thing that's happened to you in months," she said. She wasn't wrong, but I struggled to explain exactly why. Why this specifically? Why a Tuesday morning near a gate I've passed 100 times, watching a man I'll never know again handle a moment I'd seen dozens of variations of? Why that? She listened to my attempt at explanation and then said, very simply, "Because he chose who to be." I've been thinking about that ever since. Let me tell you something else about that morning that I've kept until now. About an hour before David showed up, before any of it happened, I'd been watching the two guards simply standing there. Just standing. Doing nothing in the observable sense, no action, no movement, nothing to document or describe. And I'd had a thought that I'm slightly embarrassed to admit, because it's the thought that everyone probably has at some point, the one you're vaguely ashamed of because it reveals a failure of imagination. The thought was, this must be boring. Standing still for hours in a heavy uniform in the cold. Being photographed constantly, but not as a person, as a landmark. Reduced to a thing people stand next to for an image they'll post somewhere and look at briefly, and then scroll past. Reduced to the bearskin and the scarlet and the stillness, without any of the interior life that makes stillness something different from emptiness. I thought, how do you do this without losing yourself? And then everything with David happened, and then the boy happened, and then I walked through the park and saw the family on the bench, and by the time I got to my office in Victoria, I had my answer. You don't keep yourself despite the role. The role becomes the answer to that question. You pour yourself into it until the precision is personal. Until the stillness is your stillness, specifically, and not anyone else's. Until the line you hold isn't a painted stripe on pavement, but an expression of exactly who you've decided to be. That's what I saw in him. That's what I couldn't stop thinking about. A few days after that morning, something made me start reading about the regiment. I looked it up, the unit responsible for that particular guard rotation, and I found myself reading for longer than I intended. The history of it, the requirements, the training, which is longer and considerably harder than most people standing outside those gates ever imagine. The fact that these are not decorative soldiers but active military personnel who have, many of them, served in theaters far removed from the postcard image. The bearskin, the scarlet tunic, the stillness. All of it earned. I thought about David's voice. You can break character for like 1 second. You literally won't get in trouble. The assumption in that sentence. The easy, confident assumption that the whole thing is performance. That underneath the uniform is someone bored and slightly ridiculous who would be grateful for the permission to abandon it. What he didn't understand, what I don't think he was equipped to understand, in that moment, was that there was no character to break. There was just a person, standing exactly where and how he decided to stand. That's not performance. That's the opposite of performance. I have a close friend who spent several years in the military before transitioning out, and I texted him that evening. Just described what I'd seen. He read it and called me instead of texting back, which told me it meant something to him. We talked for about 20 minutes. At one point he said something that I've thought about since. The civilians never understand that discipline isn't a cage. They look at it and they see a person trapped in a set of rules. What they can't see from the outside is that the rules are the thing that makes you free, because you already know what you're going to do. The decision's already been made. Whatever comes at you, you know who you are. He paused. Whatever comes at you, he said again, you know who you are. I want to go back to David for a moment. I've tried to be fair to him throughout this account, and I want to stay fair here, because I think he's more interesting than a simple villain. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't trying to cause harm or deliberately provoke a scene. He was operating from a set of assumptions about the world that had probably served him reasonably well for 50-something years. The assumption that the world generally accommodates him. The assumption that rules are guidelines rather than lines. The assumption that warmth and confidence can purchase exceptions. These aren't wicked assumptions, they're human ones. A lot of us carry versions of them. What the guard gave him, without intending to give him anything, was a clean, undeniable encounter with the limit of those assumptions. Not a lecture. Not a confrontation in the dramatic sense. Just a wall, not hostile, not personal, just present, just absolutely there. And David, whatever else he is, had the capacity to feel that, had the capacity to stop. That matters. I've been in rooms with people who don't have that capacity, who keep pushing past every signal, keep constructing justifications, keep insisting that the wall is wrong and they are right, and the world should simply reconfigure itself to accommodate them. David stopped. He went and sat on a bench in St. James's Park, and he looked like a man thinking. There's something in that. His daughter is the one who keeps coming back to me, though. That photograph she showed him, the one that changed something in his face. I've spent a lot of time trying to imagine what was in it. A photograph she took during the ceremony, most likely, or possibly during the confrontation itself. She was filming on her phone, I'd noticed. She might have captured the moment the guard turned his head. She might have captured her father's face in that instant. She might have captured something she wasn't trying to capture, the crowd's silence, the sudden shift in the weight of the air. Or she might have simply taken a very good photograph of the guard's face. Still exact, completely inhabited. And showed it to her father as a question. Not said as a question, shown as one. Do you see what I see in this face? I don't know, I'll never know. But the way David looked at whatever she showed him, with that specific quality of opening, of the fist unclenching, told me that something was received. Something landed somewhere it was supposed to land and hadn't before. Maybe that's the most extraordinary thing about that whole morning. A 16-year-old girl, with her phone in the rain, teaching her father something. I've been outside those gates many times since. I go more deliberately now than I used to. I make time for it in a way I didn't before that October. I don't know what I'm looking for exactly. The same guard is almost certainly never on that same rotation, or if he is, there's no way I'd identify him. They all stand identically when they're doing it right. That's the point. But I go, and I stand at the railing for a while, and I watch the crowd doing what crowds do, and I watch the guards doing what they do, and sometimes I think about David and his daughter on a bench in the park. Sometimes I think about the boy standing at attention, his feet not quite right, his chin lifted. And sometimes I just think about what it costs to choose who to be. Not once in a dramatic moment, but every morning, every hour, in the cold, in front of people who are looking at you and not seeing you, in front of cameras that will take your image and carry it somewhere far from where you're standing without ever asking your name. The same choice made again and again. Not because someone is watching, because of who you decided to be when no one was. The last thing I'll say is this. I described that morning to my mother sometime around Christmas, when we were having the kind of circular family conversation that happens at Christmas, moving from topic to topic without quite landing anywhere. I told her about the guard and the tourist and the stillness. She's in her 70s. She grew up in a different London than the one I grew up in, and a different country before she moved here. She's seen a great deal of history and has the particular quality of attention that comes from that, the quality of someone who has learned to distinguish important from dramatic, because she's seen enough drama that turned out not to matter and enough quiet moments that turned out to matter enormously. She listened to the whole story. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "The brave ones are never the ones making noise." She picked up her cup of tea. "The brave ones," she said, are the ones who stay exactly where they're supposed to be. Outside those gates, on that gray October morning, a young man in a bearskin cap and a scarlet tunic held his ground. Not against an army, against a moment. And that, in the end, was everything.